Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This is our league, and this is your league. From the 55-yard line on CFL America Radio and the Sports History Network.
This is a league of A's and BCs. It's green and red and gold and black and blue. This is a league with 2 official languages and many unofficial languages. It's East versus West, wheat versus iron, love versus hate. This is a league where superstars are extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. It's a league of ice, of fog, of mud and wind. And for one Sunday in November, it's the nation's glue. This is a league as diverse as a country, a league of Jacksons and Kwongs, Johnsons, Moscas, O'Shea's, and Haji Razulis. This is his league, her league, their league, and their league. It's my league, and it's your league. This is our league.
And welcome to the 55-yard line here with Scott and Greg. And we are here today with Dana Guster of the Historically Speaking podcast here on the Sports History Network. Dana is a former sports writer and sports broadcaster and joins us today from Atlanta to talk about African Americans who have played in the Canadian Football League. Dana, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And it's great to be able to reciprocate after you had me on your show. I think it was, last month, or if his time gone by so quick? I think
it was a few weeks ago.
Yeah,
I'm glad to be here, man. And I've been looking forward to this for a while, talking to both of you guys. And I'm late to the party when it comes to the Canadian Football League, but listening to you show and everything else, I'm glad I'm here. And then y'all making me the DJ of the party that I've been so graciously invited to. So I'm enjoying it, and I love y'all show, and I'm glad to be here.
We are very glad to have you, for sure. And I know we were talking off the air about, when you started researching some of this, going down some rabbit holes, and it is really fun. I mean, you start looking at the history of this league and, some of the groundbreaking things that it's done, and it's pretty impressive. I mean, the Canadian Football League really has a rich history.
It was, I got introduced to it when I was like 8 years old, and I didn't even know there was another league in Canada. Here I am, I'm 48. So we're talking about 40 years ago that I discovered it on ESPN by a friend of mine. I had told Greg this the last time when we had talked on my show, that the first time I had ever seen a Canadian Football League game, again, I was 8, and my friend had told me about it, and I thought it was the weirdest thing I had ever seen, but I was instantly drawn to because, of course, it's football. And, growing up like you and I growing up in the South, football is a religion here. And whether it's Canadian or high school, whatever, if it's football, I'm watching it. And even if it was in like August that I saw this game, and I just thought it was the weirdest thing ever, but I was instantly drawn to it. So that was one of the things that got me very interested in the CFL. And I came late to the party because I kind of like throughout high school and everything else, so I really didn't have a lot of access to it growing up in Louisiana. But as I've gotten older, and thanks to the internet and other things, and knowing people in Canada, they kind of opened my eyes to the Canadian Football League, and I was like instantaneously drawn to a second time. So that's why I say I'm late to the party, but hey, I'm here.
Well, you're not quite late to the party because, just talking about how you kind of came to know the CFL, it's kind of the same for me. And I know for Scott too. I mean, let's face it, we grew up in the United States of America where we didn't have access, unless you lived in Detroit or along the border, you didn't have access to the CBC feed back in the day when, the league was on the CBC. Now, obviously, in the 21st century, we've got the magic of ESPN Plus and the internet to help us along. So, but yeah, like once I was able to see the games, even though I dove into the history as much as I could, say at the library for the CFL, the internet has opened up, I think, a lot of our eyes. And I know a lot of people out there, when it comes to, CFL players, and specifically the impact the CFL has had on social justice issues, including bringing in African Americans to play key positions that unfortunately they were not allowed to play here in the United States. And so that's, there's a lot of great players out there, and we'll just start with Warren Moon and work our way from there.
Yeah.
And so, tell us in terms of, you know a lot more about on this subject than probably Scott and I do. So where do we start? Who were some of the first African Americans to play in the CFL that people here in the United States should really get to know?
Now, let me tell you, the color barrier in the CFL was actually broken 1 year before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947 in Major League Baseball. Herb Trawick, who is a name that is well known throughout the CFL. Herb Trawick played for the Montreal Alouettes in 1946. He joined them as an offensive and defensive lineman because he played both ways, and which wasn't uncommon back at that time. Yet, as with everything going back that far, there has been some discrepancy on whether he was actually the first. There was a guy that played for Saskatchewan, supposedly. Well, no one knows if he really played or not. A guy which has the coolest nickname I've ever heard. Robert Stonewall Jackson. Now imagine this. Stonewall Jackson, a black guy, but has the same name as a favorite Confederate general. That's kind of ironic, but
that's a major trolling right there.
He was in a team photo of the Rough Riders in 1930, but it's unclear whether he even played or not. So there's some discrepancy about whether he was the very first player or whether it was Herb Trawick. But Herb Trawick went to Kentucky State. He played in the CFL for roughly 10 years. And but he was one of the first players of note, and it was very interesting that he played in Montreal because because Montreal was the city that Jackie Robinson played minor league baseball with the Royals. So they've already had, and so to boost the gate receipts and the popularity of the Alouettes, with black people who was living in Montreal, they decided to sign Trawick, and he was an immediate star for that team in the late 1940s.
Yeah, wasn't that part of the ownership group in Montreal? Wasn't that one of the reasons they signed him, because of the popularity of Robinson playing with a minor league baseball team? They thought, well, maybe this could also work in football as well. I mean,
that's exactly the reason why they signed him, because because Montreal was a major hub of black people who lived in Canada, was a major hub at that time period, especially in Eastern Canada, more broadly. There was a large black population, during that time, and they wanted to capitalize off of Jackie Robinson's his popularity in Montreal and throughout all of Quebec, and signing Trawick was definitely a shot in the arm for that franchise as far as the popularity of that team with black people living in Montreal and living in Quebec broadly.
And with Montreal too, Montreal is all French. So the French have always been little bit more ahead of the curve when it comes to issues of color. For
Yes.
instance, I apologize. The name is. She was a singer in the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, and the name is escaping me now.
I know who you're talking about, Josephine Baker.
Yes,
Josephine Baker,
yep,
yeah.
yeah. And so I think that probably is part of the reason why, again, Jackie Robinson up there. But yeah, Canada's always been very, when it comes to issues of color, at least in my experience and from everything I've read, Canada's always been ahead of the curve. Up there, and again, we have prejudice everywhere, but up there, it just doesn't seem there is that prejudice that African Americans obviously experienced here in the United States, especially down south. And in your research and everything, what were some of the themes that kind of stood out when you were looking backwards and seeing who'd played there? What were Go
when
ahead.
it came down to that, I tell you, going down, like I said, I went down a rabbit hole on this, and one of the things that I had noticed was the fact that the CFL was way more welcoming of black players, regardless of position, regardless of anything, was more welcoming to black players than the NFL seemed to be at the time. For example, there was this, I guess you could say it was unwritten rule that I had read once, where it was basically said that you never have an odd number of black players on a team in the NFL. You would have like 2, 4, maybe 6 in some cases, but you would never have 3, 4, like 3, 5, or 7. And the reason why, because you have an odd number is, you have to have, black players staying together in the same room or whatever. So that was like something that was kind of frowned upon in the NFL. But in the CFL, it was way more open, way more welcoming, way more open. It didn't matter where you came from, what color you were. As long as you could play, that's what mattered, especially in the 40s and 50s, and more so than they did in the NFL. They were way more welcoming to African Americans, more so than the NFL was.
That's so interesting you mentioned that, because I didn't realize that about the NFL, but it does make perfect sense. I mean, you look at the segregated areas, if you had African American players who, whether they were going to dine together or room together or whatever. I'd never thought of that. That's an amazing stat you got there. That's incredible.
Yeah, and that was the way it was back in the days when African Americans first started playing in the National Football League in the late 40s, early 50s, you would never have an odd number of black players on a team. You would always have an even number, so they could room together and whatever have you. And but the CFL wasn't like that at all. And they were some of the most famous players in the 40s and 50s played in the NFL, but went to the CFL, and they felt it was almost like playing in a totally different world for them. And just reading some of the stories and everything from different players that I've read, they said that the CFL was way more welcoming and way more accommodating, and the fans didn't really matter where you came from or who you were or whatever. They just, long as you performed on the field, that's all that mattered to them.
Right. And who were some of the early players that people would recognize?
Now, I'm going to give you one name. Okay. Now, I said that I love nicknames. And I think he has one of the coolest football nicknames I have ever heard, especially for a receiver. And this a guy by the name of Ezra Anderson, also known as Sugarfoot Anderson.
Yep.
That is like the coolest nickname I have ever heard for a football
better
player,
than Billy White Shoes Johnson.
He played at Kentucky State, and he played receiver, and he's also defensive back. Played in the late 40s, early 50s for Calgary, and he had 116 receptions in his career, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it was a different brand of football. Even though there was more passing back then than the NFL did. It was everybody knows CFL is more of a passing league because of the rules and everything. But his best season was in 1950, when he had 46 receptions, which is unbelievable an amount of receptions for 673 yards. And having 46 catches in 1950 is, if you put it up against the stats at the time on both leagues, that's a lot of catches. and it was a different type of game then and everything. But Sugarfoot, I love that nickname. And he was one of the really first great players. Another great player, and actually the first African American, was Bernie Custis, and he played for Hamilton, played for the Tiger Cats, and he was the first, one of the first player. And very interesting note about Bernie Custis is that there's a secondary school or high school, whichever they call it different things. There's a high school that's right next door to Tim Hortons Stadium that's named after Bernie Custis, which I think was really cool. And like I said, in a show that Greg and I were on, I have, friends who live in Canada who did like my family. And they went to Hamilton. They live in Hamilton. They live right around the corner from Old Ivor Wynn Stadium, which is now Tim Hortons Stadium now. And she passed me, one of my friends, she passed me right in front of that school, and she told me about that. And I was like, wow, and there's this part of a little bit of civic pride in that, Hamilton was the site of the first Black player in the history of the CFL. And there's a point of pride of that in that city. And I thought that was so amazing, especially being someone that's African American from the South, and just to see that kind of civic pride, which I thought was just very refreshing to me.
Absolutely. I always think of, I think George Reed was born in Mississippi, but, became a naturalized citizen. And then, see, I'm an old guy, I'm 60, and I was exposed to the CFL in the mid 70s, which was right at the end of Reed's career. But I mean, good grief, this guy had over 16,000 rushing yards and 134 touchdowns, ends up becoming a naturalized citizen and becomes, just a huge part of Canadian culture, beyond what he did as a football player. So he's one of those guys that's always fascinated me, just his overall story.
Well, George Reed, I mean, that was another guy that I ran across that I hadn't really heard of until I did start doing my research. And if you were to put his stats, his rushing stats, alongside the NFL rushing stats, do you know that he would have been the third leading rusher in NFL history?
Really?
Wow.
Third lead, he would have been behind Emmitt Smith and Walter Payton. He had more rushing yards than Jim Brown when he retired.
Wow, I did not know that.
And I thought that was so amazing of a guy that he played his whole career in Saskatchewan. And he was just amazing. He was 6 foot, 205, I think is his measurements were, but he was just so amazing, such an amazing run. I actually looked up some film footage of him, and he was nice.
Right.
He kind of reminded you, looking at it, he kind of reminded you of maybe like the Walter Payton, maybe a little bit taller version of Walter Payton. He wasn't overly big, but he wasn't small either. He was just an average size running back, but he had unbelievable balance and speed. He could run over you if he needed to. He had that type of power, but he was more of a speed back. And he was just such an amazing player. And I had never heard of him until I started doing this research. And this is one of the things I love about this is that, you start going down and you start learning new things and stuff like that. And then you become more and more attached to the subject matter, like I am attached to the CFL, and which is something that I did not expect doing this, but is one of the great surprises of doing what we do.
Yeah, and that's I'm the same way. And I know Scott is too. And to put that that rushing career in perspective, for those listening here live in the States, you have to keep in mind it's a 3-down game up there.
It's right.
And that extra down makes a huge difference. So to have those numbers just tells you kind of the impact player he was, much like Andrew Harris today that plays for the Blue Bombers. The Blue Bombers are the one exception in that league right now. They've got 2 backs, and they are a power run team. They're just as dangerous on the run as they are with the pass.
And that's something that a lot of people from the United States don't realize. It's 3 downs, the field's bigger, and then the defensive line is 1 yard off the ball instead of being on the ball. And it's a totally different game, and it just kind of lends itself to being more of a passing league.
Yeah.
And guys like George Reed and guys like Cookie Gilchrist and
Oh,
guys,
I love Cookie.
and
Cookie.
and other guy like Mike Pringle,
Yeah.
they ran the ball. Another guy with a great nickname was Michael Pinball Clemens.
Yep.
Those guys
Yep.
were just turned a league that's primarily known for passing, turn that into a running league where they became stars as runners, in a league that was totally designed and lend itself for passing.
Absolutely. I mean, to me, in the Canadian League, if you can become a superstar, as you just said, Dana, if you can become a superstar as a running back, you're something special. Just for the reason you said, because in a 3-down game, there's a sense of urgency every down. You don't get, like in the American game, you don't get the first down to kind of feel out what the defense is doing. Every single down has to matter.
And if
Right.
you're gonna run, you're gonna pass to set up the run.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which was an old, as you could tell, those who are listening, I'm wearing a LA Chargers hat, and I'm been a Chargers fan since I was like 8, 9 years old. And Sid Gilman used to say that anybody that says that you have to run to set up the pass is full of crap. You got to pass to set up the run. Okay, and that is gospel truth in Canada. It may not be that way in the American game, but in the Canadian game, you have to run to set up the pass. And those guys that I just mentioned, were just outstanding runners who basically turned that kind of theory on its head, but just because of their talent,
Right.
just because of their own natural running talent.
Yeah. And then also translates over to the quarterback position too, where, I'll use last night's game. Last night, Vernon Adams Jr., he's watching him play, he's the best quarterback in the CFL, if you ask me, because he's very much in that Tracy Ham mode where it's a dual threat. I know in my simulation CFL league, I love giving the ball to Tracy Ham because, I have Mike Pringle in the backfield. Unfortunately, Mike Pringle on paper is not as good as the Mike Pringle in real life, just the way the dice rolls go. But when it comes to Tracy Ham, boom, takes off. So, CFL quarterbacks, CFL players have to be very versatile. And, if you're a running back, you've got to be a threat coming out of that backfield too, because, again, that extra down just makes such a huge difference.
You mentioned Tracy Ham. Tracy Ham was one of the first players that I was kind of like his John the Baptist when I was in high school and in college, because I started watching, whenever I could get to CFL, living in Louisiana.
Right.
The Argos would be playing, and Tracy Ham would be on the team, and I was like his John the Baptist, kind of speaking, because he was drafted by the Rams, but he didn't play for the Rams at all. He went straight to the CFL, and 2-time Grey Cup champ, 1995 Grey Cup Most Valuable Player, 1989 CFL Most Outstanding Player in his third season, I think it was, second or third year. And he was like in that mode of a, smallish running quarterback, like a Lamar Jackson type of guy, but he was unbelievably fast and unbelievably quick, but he had a rifle for an arm, and he was just the world first dual threat quarterback in either, he was at the same time around Randall Cunningham with the Eagles, but in Canada, he was such a valuable weapon because of exactly what we were talking about, the urgency on every play, to get the 10 yards, to get the first down, because you don't have that one down to play with. You got to go right then and there to get the first down, because you only got 2 tries before you punt.
Right.
So Tracy Ham was just such an unbelievable player, during that time period and throughout all of CFL history.
Yeah, and he is considered, he quarterbacked what is considered by many to be the greatest CFL team ever assembled.
Right.
Now, whether that was because it was all Americans or the ratio, who knows? But that's the one team people still talk reverently of up there in Canada as being one of the greatest ever.
Wow. Now that I didn't. Now that I didn't know. What year that was? The '89
No,
team.
that was 94 and 95 that the Stallions played
Oh,
in
okay.
Baltimore.
Okay, the Stallions. That's right.
Yeah.
Because the 1 year that the Stallions won with him and Mike Pringle, that was an amazing team.
Right.
And we heard a little bit about that, down here in Louisiana. Though we didn't, we had the Pirates, but the Pirates were the Pirates. But
Yeah.
I mean that experiment in having American-based teams in the CFL,
Yeah.
kind of lended itself to try to grow the popularity of the sport, and it did for a while, especially here in Louisiana, with the Pirates, and it was some interesting times, back in the mid '90s, because I was in college back then, and I wanted to try to get to a game out there, but I just couldn't make it, but I wish I would have, though, really.
I was going to ask you, since we're both, Southern guys that had Southern CFL teams, if you, were able to be a fan or not. I was working for a newspaper at the time, so I actually got to cover their first game, and sort of, after that, I was stuck covering racing and other sports and stuff, but I still remained a fan. And I just thought, maybe the American experiment would work out much better than it obviously did. So yeah, that's interesting to know that you were in college when the Shreveport Pirates were around, and unfortunately you didn't have too long to cheer for them. Just kind of like the Barracudas, we were one and done here in Birmingham.
Yeah, I mean, it was, they're playing, in Shreveport, and they had to play all their games at night, because there's nowhere in the world you could play a CFL, you play a football game at Independence Stadium in Shreveport with all of those aluminum metal benches reflecting the sun and playing on artificial turf. And it was just and then the whole stadium setup was not conducive to the Canadian game, because they had to kind of like make accommodations to make that work. And it was just a big mess in Shreveport, from what I remember.
How was the field? Was it regulation size, or did they
have it was a regulation size, but what they had to do was they had to take out some of the stands on the end zone to have to fit the end zone, the Canadian end zone. Okay. So they had to take some seats out to make that work.
Yeah. The reason why I ask is when, doing my, I've done research on the CFL, when they were in the US, but you see very few pictures of what the stadiums were like other than Memphis. Right. Because Memphis was the glaring example of, America doesn't have the fields for a Canadian game.
But the thing is that in the end zones at Independence Stadium, for what I remember back then, is that they were temporary. Okay. Even when they had the Independence Bowl, they were temporary stands in each end zone, so they could just move them back.
Okay, gotcha.
It's just the permanent parts of Independence Stadium was on the sidelines. And they had to kind of really squeeze them in. The sidelines were so narrow, at Independence Stadium, and it was a mess. But I wish I would have had the chance to attend a Pirates game, when the Pirates were in Shreveport.
Well, when we had Matt Dunnigan on a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about, what he had hoped is that Birmingham would have the vast majority of their games on Thursday, because then you weren't competing with high school football, college football, or the NFL. But then the owner of the Barracudas thought it would be best to play games on Sunday, because he thought, well, NFL fans would still rather watch their local team. But obviously that was a huge miscalculation.
I think he would have had a better chance doing it on Thursday nights, because of just exactly what they were talking about. Like in Alabama, you're gonna compete against high school football? No. Bama and Auburn, forget it. In the NFL on Sunday, I don't know. But with Birmingham being something of a local team, maybe it could have worked on Sunday, but they tried it and didn't work.
Yeah, and that's what I hoped as a someone trying to separate myself from a sports writer as a fan. Yeah, because I love the CFL. I would watch it on Sunday, but then I could see how rank and file people, members of my family, like my dad, he said, well, CFL is fine, but I just can't get used to the 3 downs. So, he was always going to, if it came down to an American football game against the CFL game, he was going to choose the American game 10 times out of 10.
And that's a lot in the South. That's a lot in the South when you see that.
Yeah, which, just talking about that, it's if anybody's watched the games the last 2 weeks, I don't know who wouldn't love Canadian football. This week, man, some of the games weren't the greatest, but the week before that opening weekend, it's like, what, at least for me, when I was really first really started watching it, after about, I don't know, about the second set of possessions, I completely forgot about it only being 3 downs. It was football.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
I'm a Hamilton Tiger Cats fan, so I can tell you if I just started watching the CFL this year, I'd be having a problem right now.
A little bit.
Because the Ticats have not been fun to watch.
No.
You got to score more. You got to average more than 7 points a game to win.
Well, I have not followed, and just kind of digressing a little bit about this weekend. This morning I woke up and I was reading stuff about the Elks on the Elks fan pages. The Elks fans are not happy at all. And yeah. So anyway,
now,
I digress. Go ahead.
Now, speaking of the Elks, we having this discussion about the CFL and blacks in the Canadian Football League. And when you talk about the Elks, there's one person that you have to discuss, of course, and that is Mr. Warren Moon.
That's where it starts and ends with, in terms of he is right there at the top of that discussion pyramid.
I mean, 5 consecutive Grey Cup titles. I mean, come on. He was the first quarterback to throw for over 5,000 yards, and in 1983 he passed for 5,600 yards. Put that in perspective. 5,600 yards passing in a season.
Right.
Some people don't do that in a career, much less 1 year. And it was through, Hugh Campbell and the offense, and Warren Moon was the first star of the Canadian Football League that I really remember. And being an 8-9-year-old, first of all, being from the South, of course they had Doug Williams at Tampa Bay, right. And then you had Warren Moon in Canada along with Condredge Holloway, which I'm going to talk about in a minute.
Oh, good. I love Condredge Holloway is my favorite CFL player of all time.
And Warren Moon was the first one that I remember because, like, when I first started watching it when I was in my younger years, 8, 9, 10 years old, when he used to come on ESPN every week, Edmonton would be playing, and he'd be. First of all, seeing a black quarterback, I'm like, this is different, and. He was so much fun to watch. First of all, I don't ever remember Warren Moon ever throwing like a ball that had any bit of a wobble in it at all. Everything was just a perfect spiral, and especially with the ball, with the stripes on the ball, it just looked so precise, and he was just a talent. Even back when he was at Washington, I remember watching an old Rose Bowl game where he was in. And when he threw the ball looked like it blinked in the air because the spiral was just so tight, and it was always on target. And he was just so much fun to watch. Even later years with the Oilers, and then with me living in South Louisiana, just right up the street from Houston, about an hour and a half away from Houston, we got a lot of Oiler games, and he was just so much fun to watch. But the success that he had in Canada is just unsurpassed by anybody, and he's one of the greatest, if not the greatest, quarterback to play ever in the CFL.
Yeah, he was during the time when, if you got the paper the next morning, you knew that he had led Edmonton to a win, regardless of who they played. He just.
But then again, nobody really was on Edmonton's level during that time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Totally a class by themselves.
Yeah, and when what is it? I'm sorry, it's early morning and I've only had 1 cup of coffee. 5 championships, right?
Yeah,
in a row.
5 straight, 5 consecutive championships.
And this is what frustrates me with people in the United States who look at the Canadian football like, well, it's CFL. Hey, do you know how hard it is to win 5 championships in a row in any league?
Any league, right?
Yes. And, it's just a shame he never got to the Super Bowl here. I think it would have been awesome to see the Oilers, number one, go to a Super Bowl. That would have probably kept him in Houston.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would have been a nice bow to put on, to wrap up his career, to have both the Grey Cup championship and a Super Bowl championship. Even just to get to the Super Bowl would have been an accomplishment in itself. But to be able to see somebody from the Canadian League with all the success that he had come down here and have equal success, and he came close.
Yeah, he came close. I mean, unfortunately, he ran into the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs, when they had Joe Montana
Yeah.
and the infamous comeback,
Right.
against losing to the Bills. But when you talk about, but can you imagine what the discussion would be had he won a Super Bowl? Now, put this into perspective. Had Warren Moon won a Super Bowl, will we talk about Warren Moon as possibly the greatest quarterback in football history?
Well, it bothers me that he's not talked about as one of the greatest quarterbacks in football history.
Because he would have accomplished something that no one else had ever done.
Right.
He won a Rose Bowl. He won 5 consecutive Grey Cups and add a Super Bowl to that.
Yeah.
We would be talking about him as one of the greatest. I mean, he is one of the greatest quarterbacks ever in the history of football, but his stature would be so much higher had he won a Super Bowl. I mean, we would be comparing, and you talk about all the yards he passed for in his career. If you total up all of the yards that he passed in the CFL and the NFL with the Oilers in the running shoot, is astronomical. It really is. And he played primarily in the running shoot his whole career in Houston. And then he went over to other places, went to Seattle, went to Minnesota, and they were also passing teams. So they catered the offense towards him, and they just let you know his talent, his overall leadership skills, and overall talent of throwing the football, as we say down here in the South, his ability to spin it is just amazing.
Yeah. And, on that subject, talking about the great quarterbacks up there, do you have any insight as to why Damon Allen, I mean, he had a Hall of Fame career in Canada, why he never came down to the States Marcus Allen's brother.
Yeah.
How come he never came to the States? Do you know?
That's a very good question. I think that what it might have been was that when we talk about Damon Allen, I think his thing was that he didn't want to play in the shadow of his brother.
Okay.
He is Marcus Allen's younger brother. Marcus Allen, Super Bowl MVP, Hall of Fame running back for the Raiders and Chiefs. He probably would have been, no matter what he did here in the States, he would have been probably regarded as always been, well, he's Marcus Allen's little brother. And I think that he wanted an identity all his own in Canada. I mean, you look at his career, 4
I'm looking at the numbers right now. They're off the charts.
Grey Cup championships, 1987 and 1993 and 2004 Grey Cup most valuable player. Okay, he was a league MVP in 2005, and he was the second oldest player to win a league most valuable player next to Gordie Howe. And he was 42 when he was the league MVP.
Yeah, I mean, his longevity is, he played, you just look at the length he played.
Yeah. I mean, the amount of games and the amount of years that he played, and he played for several different teams. He played for Edmonton twice. He played for Ottawa, Hamilton, British Columbia, Toronto. He played for a lot of different teams. He almost played for the entire league. But his longevity was something to speak of. And I think that the reason why he didn't come to the States, because he definitely had the talent. Definitely had the talent, both running and throwing. He would have been always considered Marcus Allen's brother. And I think that he just wanted that identity all his own and didn't want to be in the shadow of his brother, which I can understand, and then you have a very rabid following in Canada with all the success and the longevity that you played up in Canada. I don't blame him one bit. I probably would have done the same thing.
Yeah, and there's also the issue that, certainly the money's not like it is in the NFL, but especially if you were that good, you can make a very comfortable living. There's also marketing deals, advertising, everything else. And if you invest well, you're absolutely fine. But that's what amazes me is just the longevity. And if you look at a lot of the superstars of the CFL over the years, especially when they play for a pretty good amount of time, they play for a lot of different teams. That's why it's always fun when I look at somebody like Reed or Trawick who spent their entire career, with one team. That's incredibly rare.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is rare. It's rare nowadays in any sport, but even in Canada with so few teams, that you see a lot of these superstar players go to different teams. And I think, I'm not concretely sure about this. This is just a theory that I may have, is that the reason why that was because that maybe that going to greener pastures other places, or maybe that the contracts that they want to pay these players, they just didn't have the money for it, but another team did or whatever. So that might figure into a lot of these really big time stars moving on to different teams and different teams and everything. So I think that's probably I'm not concretely sure on that, but that's just a theory.
Well, could it be too? And I'm just thinking, we're talking about this. Could it be a question of, is it better to be a small fish in a big pond or a big fish in a small pond? And I'll use the example of Milt Stegall.
Yes.
Milt Stegall, probably could play today if he wanted to, but he's an institution up in Winnipeg.
Right. Milt Stegall, known as, I consider him and a lot of people as well, the Jerry Rice of the CFL.
Yeah.
He was smooth like Jerry Rice. Their body build is very similar.
Yeah.
Their bodybuilder is extremely similar, but Milt Stegall, CFL most valuable, CFL MVP in 02, had 15,153 yards receiving in his career with Winnipeg. And, just an unbelievable smooth receiver. He started off his career in the NFL with the Bengals, and he only played there for 1 year, I believe. Yeah. And then came over to Canada and then started off, and went to Winnipeg and then set the league on fire with his receiving, and he was a lot like Jerry Rice. Watching him, and if you didn't realize that was Milt Stegall, you would think that was Jerry Rice, because they're the same style, same body type, same ability, everything. And he was just so smooth with those Winnipeg teams.
And they both got, in addition to that, is when those guys are on TV, you stop and listen.
Yeah. They have a charisma about them that was just so they were just so impressive, and then you could just listen to them all day long, and then and everything they say, you could take that to the bank pretty much, because they're both very, very, very smart guys, and in Jerry Rice being from a historical Black college and university, that was something cool right there,
Yeah. Well, talking about personalities and charisma, let's talk about Cookie Gilchrist.
Oh boy, Cookie Gilchrist. One of my favorite stories about Cookie Gilchrist was that when he was in Buffalo, he played in the NFL the end of his career in Buffalo, in Denver, and Miami.
Which is essentially like playing in Canada, because you're right there.
Right. This is doing the AFL. This is doing the days of the AFL.
Yeah.
And Cookie drove a pink Cadillac in Buffalo, and on the front of his car, in the front of this first of all, it's a pink Cadillac in Buffalo. So of course you're going to know who it is. But on the front bumper, he had on there written, "Looky, looky, here comes Cookie," on the front of the Cadillac, which is which is basically his personality, but he was also very outspoken, as far as race and discrimination. Even in Canada, we talked about earlier about how welcoming it was, but it was also important to mention that you can't, taking racism out of the world, like taking water out of the ocean, it was always there, but he's the only man, for what I understand, the only man ever to refuse induction into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame for that reason. And he was very adamant. He didn't want, because he could, you look at his stats, 4,000, close to 5,000 yards rushing. He was a 1957 Grey Cup MVP for Hamilton. Just a power runner. If you had to compare him to somebody today, the first person I think of is Derrick Henry. because he was a big, strong, but he was very athletic for his size. If you look at pictures of him, he's trying to tackle him like trying to tackle an apartment building. I mean, he was just massive, but he had the speed to outrun DBs, which was impressive as well.
Would it be fair?
And he was kind of blackballed out of the AFL because of his stance on racism, and kind of blackballed. And he just basically said, "Look, I'm flattered by the invitation, but I'm not going into the CFL Hall of Fame because of his stance on racism and racism in the league that he encountered, in the CFL and of course in the AFL. And it was in one of the major social stories of the 60s that a lot of people don't talk about was he led the boycott of the 1964 AFL All-Star game in New Orleans.
Right.
That a lot of people don't know about.
That was moved to Houston, wasn't it? Because of that reason?
Yeah. Like all of the black players that was on the AFL All-Star teams, like guys like Earl Faison, Ernie Ladd, Cookie Gilchrist, Abner Haynes, all those guys refused to play in the AFL All-Star game, which was in New Orleans. And New Orleans was trying to get a team in the AFL. And that, and that was kind of like a black mark against the city of New Orleans. And so they ended up having to move the AFL All-Star game to Houston, like at the last minute, and because the black players organized a walkout, and that walkout was led by Cookie Gilchrist.
Yeah, and he ended his career in Miami, right?
Yeah, he played last game in Miami, which is one of the funniest things I'd ever seen because he wore number 2 when he played in the. Can you imagine a guy like 6'1", 230, 235 in the 60s, wearing the number 2, carrying the ball? That's just a weird look for me. He may be the last, I could be wrong, but he may be the last skill position player to wear a single-digit number in pro football.
Really?
I may be wrong, but it just seemed like that would be, that might be the case. The last skill position player to wear a single-digit number in pro football in America, in the States.
Okay, yeah, and really thought about that. I know on that, he was right at the end of his career, so I know. And didn't he get traded to Denver at that, or was Miami his last stop?
I think Miami was the last team because they came into the AFL in '66.
Okay.
And he had been with Buffalo, and I think he followed Lou Saban to Denver when the Bills, when he left, when Lou Saban left the Bills to go to Denver. I think Cookie followed him to Denver.
Okay.
And then he ended his career in, or maybe the other way around. I'm not exactly sure on how that turned out, but I do remember Cookie playing for Denver, and I do remember him playing for the Dolphins, wearing number 2 in that aqua and blue, in that aqua and orange. I do remember that.
And in terms of staying on running back theme, so one of the greatest names in Canadian football, if you were to mention anybody down here, the name Pinball Clemens.
Pinball Clemens, yep.
People would look at you going, "Who's Pinball Clemens?" But up in Canada, he can't walk the street. I mean, he can't, when he walks the streets, no matter where he's at in Canada, people are getting their pictures taken with Pinball.
He's an institution.
The reason why that
is,
it has more to do, I think it has a lot to do with, or as much to do with his playing career as his personality.
Right. And everything he has contributed up there. He is he is an institution in Canada. And in Toronto, he has done it all. I mean, you'd look at somebody who truly is a CFL lifer, who is for lack of a better term, your Swiss Army knife.
Right.
Pinball Clemens has done it all. And I don't know off the top of my head, has he ever played the quarterback position? Because it wouldn't surprise me if he stepped in, much like Walter Payton did on a couple snaps, to cover down on to pinch hit at the QB position.
I don't think he played quarterback. He might have did it like in a pinch, maybe once or twice in a game. But Pinball Clemens, you said, he was a player, coach, executive, all for Toronto. you're right. He's an institution. He's a, what do you call, a lifer. I mean, there are guys who've been in leagues and everything for a lot of years, but Pinball Clemens was one of those men that he was with the, I mean, and he was with Toronto pretty much his whole career.
Right.
If you were to think about it. He was such a, I mean, and just he had such of an electric personality. I can remember when I was, when I first got back into the CFL back in the 90s and 2000s, he was all over the place, and not only just playing, but he just conversing with the fans and just had this just electric personality. He has 6 Grey Cups in his career.
Yeah.
He won 6 Grey Cup titles, 25,000 all-purpose yards, both running, receiving, punt and kick returns. I mean, this guy did it all, and he wasn't that big. I mean, he was just he was sort of like Barry Sanders in a way. That's
Right.
why they called him Pinball.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's the nickname.
Unbelievable
Bounce off people.
He had just unbelievable balance. He just bounce off people, and just maintain balance and just keep on going. He was just an electric talent, and I think that had he played in the NFL, he would have been just an electric personality, and everybody would have known who he was, But he just never had that opportunity to play in the NFL, mostly because of his slight stature, which I think is unfair.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I think some of the reason why you don't see people, especially the stars coming down from the CFL down to the States is like going back to that little that fish analogy that I gave. Henry Burris is a case in point, who is now here coaching with the Bears. But Henry Burris had a cup of coffee with the Bears. And I remember hearing the name, and then it went away. And then, in the 2000s, wait a minute, that name sounds familiar. And then I did some digging, did not realize how big of a star, Hank is up in Canada. And so it was fun to be able to, watching a Bears game, or actually watching the CF, talking Bears stuff. And then hey, remember Henry Burris? Yeah, barely. Who's that? I go, no, he's a big star in Canada. Really? And so it's been fun to watch. It was fun to watch him end his career the way he did, basically leading an expansion team to a title.
That's right.
An expansion team with a losing record too.
Yeah.
Didn't they have
Yeah, I don't off the top of my head remember, but yeah, title's a title.
Wow. Another guy, and y'all mentioned him earlier, and he was the subject of a documentary a few years ago, Condredge Holloway.
Thank you.
Scott
Yeah,
talked
my
about
hero.
him being his favorite player of all, one of his favorite CFL players, from and the documentary, The Color Orange, the Condredge Holloway story. I watched that one time, and I was like, before I watched, I was like, I know the name, but I'm not familiar with the name. I knew he was a quarterback at Tennessee. I knew that, and everything else, but I never knew his career in Canada. And I vaguely remember the name from my childhood, but watching him play, I was like, wow, this guy is something else. And again, one of the really hidden gems in the history of the Canadian Football League that no one really knows too much about here in the States. And, Condredge Holloway was this 2-time Grey Cup champion in Toronto with the Argos, and they had that famous game between them and Edmonton where both of them threw for 1 billion yards, and him and Moon threw for 1,000 yards each, maybe, I guess. But it was Condredge Holloway was another hidden gem that was in Canada and became a hero to a lot of Canadians over the years.
I just loved everything about his game. I mean, he was a great passer. He was a great runner. I mean, he could think on his feet and make the right decisions. And he was but it was all in such an exciting package. And the thing is, I think the reason I was such a big fan is, he prepped in the state of Alabama. He was from Huntsville, Alabama.
Right.
So I kind of knew who he was before he even went to college. You follow him in college where he's a great player, and then he goes to CFL and he's a great player. And he's just one of those guys that, just from the standpoint of being a fan, it was always just an absolute pleasure and honor to watch him play.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he was, just one of those, and he's a great person. I think he's
It really is.
still, I think he's still with the University of Tennessee as a assistant athletic director there, and he was just, did a lot of things for the University of Tennessee. Just an outstanding person, but even more, just an outstanding football player, for Toronto. There was another guy, Chuck Ely,
Yeah,
first
that's what I
black
was just going to
quarterback to
mention
win a
his
Grey
name.
Cup.
Yeah, the stone thrower.
Yeah, he's the first black quarterback to win a Grey Cup with Hamilton in 1972 over Saskatchewan. I heard a lot about him. He was, just another great quarterback from the University of Toledo. Just another great quarterback. His career really didn't last too long, but he was still got that Grey Cup title on his belt, so that's a plus for him.
And he came from a really small college too. You think?
Yeah,
He came from
Toledo, right?
Toledo.
So I mean, the Rockets isn't really known as a football hotbed, in the MAC, but coming from Toledo in that time,
Yeah.
and going up to Canada and having the success that he had, people still speak very highly of Chuck Ely in Hamilton.
Right. And have you seen the documentary, the Canadian documentary Engraved on a Nation? And there's a whole
I
episode
have not, but
devoted.
that's on my list to watch because I started doing this again. I went down the rabbit hole doing this, and I'm like, I'm running out of time, but I need to watch this, So that's like on my list to watch.
Right. Well, the one thing that I always kind of get on the CFL about is they don't have their version of NFL films. But in the last, say in the last 10 years, the TSN has tried their best to kind of step into that breach and give CFL fans something NFL films like. And they did an 8-part series on Engraved on a Nation. And, I'll be honest with you. Hey, there were bootleg copies on YouTube, and I grabbed every one of them because I knew they weren't going to stay up long. And the one with him was my favorite. And I'll try to find it for you and try to get you a copy of it because
I really appreciate that.
It's buried here as we're sitting. I've got a ton of hard drives here full of football games and documentaries. At some point, I got a catalog. Once I retire, I'll probably have more time to catalog and sort through. But of all the 8-part series, that one was my favorite because it was to me it was the most inspiring to see what he overcame. Back in the 70s. I mean, back in the early 70s in the NFL. I mean, there was the unwritten rule.
Right.
I mean, there were a few guys who came. James Harris, a good example. That were able to play in the NFL, but there was but up in Canada,
No, I mean there was no unwritten rule. I mean, you think about that unwritten rule, quote unquote. You think of Marlon Briscoe.
Right.
Marlon the Magician played in Denver. He was the first black quarterback to start on a regular basis, and he had to do it in the AFL. And then over time they converted him to a receiver. But up until a few years ago, he had the most touchdown passes by a Broncos rookie. Even he had more touchdown passes as a rookie than John Elway did.
Really?
And he was just so amazing. And he only played like maybe 3/4 of his rookie year. He played quarterback, and he held the record for most touchdown passes by a Broncos rookie. Which lasted for close to 30 years. Which a lot of people don't realize, but he didn't work out as a quarterback because they traded him to Buffalo right after, and they converted him to a receiver, and he never played quarterback again. But if you watch film of Marlon Briscoe, he was a lot like a Kyler Murray in the 60s. Forget about Tracy Ham. He was, in the 60s for an AFL team, and he was elusive, he was short, but he had unbelievable accuracy, but he was the most athletic, and he was a fan favorite in Denver. And had he stayed in Denver and stayed at quarterback, what would the Broncos franchise turned out with him and Floyd Little? Can you imagine that?
Holy smoke.
And kind of on that theme, JC Watts as a person that, I saw back when I was a kid play, and then it was like he kind of disappeared on us.
Right.
What happened? I mean, he was up in Canada, but nobody, we remember him for what he did in government. But tell us about his career in Canada.
J.C. Watts, I remember watching him as a kid at the University of Oklahoma, running the wishbone under Barry Switzer, and he goes to Canada, and no one thought that he could throw, okay? But when he went up to Canada, he proved that this dude could throw, But it was like he's like another one of those hidden gems that was in Canada, was a big star, came back to the United States, and people were like, okay, what happened to him? I remember J.C. Watts at Oklahoma, and now he's a senator, or now he's in Congress. If I'm not mistaken, he's still maybe in Congress. I'm not sure.
I don't know. Let me take a look here.
But J.C. Watts was another one of those hidden gems in the CFL that American fans don't really know and don't really totally appreciate what he did up there north of the border.
You always had to feel for wishbone quarterbacks, though, regardless of their talent level. Like you said, even if you're a really good passer, if you're a wishbone quarterback in college back in the 70s, you might throw 2 passes a game. It just.
With Barry Switzer's offense, if you throw 2 passes in a game, that was like almost a career high.
Right.
But they were just so effective with it. Not that they didn't like to run, didn't like to throw it. They just didn't have to, And, wishbone quarterbacks have always had this stigma where they can't throw. They always run, they getting beat up and all of this other stuff. And you're talking about, me, I ran the wishbone when I was in Pee Wee. So I knew what they, ran the wishbone as a quarterback, and I know the beating that they took firsthand. Right. Which only lasted like 2 games, but that's another story.
Well, and getting back to that, because you mentioned Kyler Murray. And when Kyler Murray first came into the NFL, my first thought was, man, he'd be the perfect CFL quarterback.
He would be.
And it's interesting to see now, and for those who watch the CFL, we can now see in the NFL a lot of the CFL. Because the NFL has turned to a CFL game.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people talk about. Well, it's just a spread offense, and they've been running the spread in the CFL since the 1960s, 70s. Yeah. They've been running that just without the shotgun.
Right. Well, and the run and shoot was developed up in Canada. Willie was perfected up there. You're talking about Conrad Holloway,
right?
Mouse Davis and that whole team that won the Grey Cup in the early '80s was. So people talk about, it's revolutionary. Like, no, it's been around a while.
It's been around. It's just been up in Canada. That no one, and that's one thing about the Canadian League that I've learned is that you have so many great players and so many great games and so many guys that could have come to the United States and played in the NFL that would have been household names. Yeah. They would have been household names just for some of the things that they've done. And, and it was a shame that a lot of these black players that we talked about never really had as much of an opportunity that they did here in the United States that they did in Canada. Yeah. And they once they got the opportunity to play their game, right, that was what, and that set them apart from a lot of the other players, and they became household names in Canada and heroes to a whole nation.
Yeah. And, and on that too, there's the playing aspect, but there's also another aspect of what the CFL has excelled in, and that is in the front office. Right. And I'm going to use Jeffrey Orridge.
Yes. Yeah.
Tell us about Jeffrey and his time as CFL commissioner.
First African American named as commissioner of a league, any league in North America. He was commissioner, and being commissioner, he wasn't commissioner too long, maybe like a couple of years, but still impressive. He was just an impressive man, and and another thing is that, you talk about leadership positions, Willie Wood, let's talk about him.
Yeah. It's, you know what? That was actually, I've got my list out of guys that we haven't talked about, and Willie Wood's right there.
He was a head coach of the Philadelphia Bell in 1975 before he came to the Argos as head coach in 80. So he kind of broke a couple of barriers there.
That's right. That's right. He was, first of all, he was a Hall of Fame defensive back with the Packers, under Lombardi. And he brought that leadership to the World Football League in the mid-'70s and in the CFL in 1980 with the Argos. And he was 7 years before Art Shell became head coach of the Raiders, the first black coach in the National Football League. He had beat, Willie Wood had beat Art Shell by 7 years. So that gives you a prime example of the forward thinking, that the Canadian Football League had as far as looking upon minorities in leadership positions. And Willie Wood is the perfect example. He was, he learned a lot under Lombardi, the Lombardi system, so to speak, and he brought that up to Canada and had success.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, gentlemen, we are approaching the end here, and
this has been fun.
This has been great. This has been awesome. And Dana, I apologize we didn't get to do this before, before we did until now. And so my apologies for not having you come on sooner.
Oh man, look, as long as you have me on, man, I'm enjoying myself. I had a lot of fun today talking with y'all, talking CFL, and hey, it's football season, man. And hey, I'm down with whatever, bro. And I really appreciate y'all having me on. I really do.
Well, we'll definitely have you on again. And hey, before we end here, let everybody know where they can find you. They know Twitter, social media, the internet, what have you.
Okay, I am the host of Historically Speaking Sports podcast right here on the Sports History Network. You could also check me out on Twitter at historicallysp2. That's my Twitter handle. And if you need to get in touch with me in any way, you can contact me by email, historically.speaking.sports.com. At gmail.com. And I really enjoyed being on with you guys. And whenever y'all need me back to talk more CFL or anything else, feel free. Just contact a brother, hook a brother up, will you?
Oh, most definitely.
You definitely will.
Most definitely. Hey, and real quick,
I had a lot of fun though, man. This was so much fun, I tell you.
Before we let you go, what do you got coming up? What shows you got coming up? Are you doing the Harlem Globetrotters like I asked you?
Well, I haven't done that yet. I might do that when basketball season starts coming around again.
Okay.
But right now, I'm in a process of putting together it's like, I don't know if you want to call it a mini series, but it's going to be a series of shows that deal specifically with the NFL. And the one that I have coming up within a few days is we recently had 3 guys from historical black colleges and universities be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And my upcoming show, my main event, will talk about all of the players that's in Canton that came from historical black colleges and universities.
Okay.
Great.
Awesome.
And also coming up in a couple of weeks, I had put together last year, I did this in a blog, but I'm going to put together a show totally around this, okay? And it's going to be just a special show. I had put together, if each franchise put together a fantasy team, every NFL franchise's all-time fantasy team, 2 quarterbacks, 2 running backs, 3 receivers, like a fantasy football league, but with each NFL franchise, what would that look like?
Oh man, that's going to be Greg's porn right there. I can tell you.
Yeah. I was just going to say that's what simulation football is all about.
Who would be the, like, for example, who would be the 2 running backs for, say, the Titans? Would it be Derrick Henry? Would it be Eddie George? Would it be Earl Campbell? Would it be Charlie Henry? I mean, who would it be? Who would be your 2 running backs? Yeah. Who would be the quarterbacks for the Pittsburgh Steelers?
Yeah.
If this was fantasy.
Would you take Roethlisberger or would you take Bradshaw?
Exactly.
It's I'm dealing with that actually quandary right now. I've got the Arizona Cardinals in one sim league. So we've taken the current Cardinals and we're going to match them together with some of the old timers.
See, and that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm doing right here.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to talk more offline about my simulation football league stuff because you'll love it. You'll love it.
Yeah.
You will be able to ask. You know what? You will be able to answer the question of who was the greatest team ever. Sure, it's and you'd be surprised at some of the answers too, as I was one time when I realized the '67 Raiders were a lot better than '68 Colts. So.
Oh yeah, I could tell you that.
Yeah. But until you see it played out in front of you, it's like, you can conjecture and go like, no, the computer says this is how it's. Like, oh, okay. Then you look at the numbers. And so anyway, I'm getting off track here. Hey, guys. Hey, thanks for joining us. Dana, thank you for joining us. And Scott.
Man, it was been a blast.
Oh, man.
Really has. Thanks so much.
Hey, and one more thing before we end here. We're in the Fantasy Football League together. I know Scott and I, we've got the CFL Americans in our NFL Fantasy Football League.
Oh, do we?
Our sports, yes, we do.
Okay. Shows you how involved I am.
And hey, Dana, which team? Let everybody know because people are going to be able to kind of follow this once we get going. And I know I'm kind of the ringleader on getting this all set up. But for those who are looking at want to follow us along, it's going to be we're going to have a link up at sportshistorynetwork.fans. And we're working on it. Which team is yours?
Mine is a team called the West End War Machine. That's the name of my team, and you see the Charger logo on it, but that's the name of my team. West End is a part of the town that is a section of New Iberia, Louisiana, where I grew up in, called West End, and I just like the name War Machine, so that's how I came up with it. And this would be my first time playing fantasy football in about 20 years.
Really?
Yeah. First time in about 20 years I've played.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be awesome playing this year because we're going to have smack talk going left and right.
Now, see, now I'm really hooked now because I'll trash talk with the best. So.
And the best part about this is, at least with the league, at least for me, is we're able to use auto draft, which to me kind of helps out because there's nothing worse than being in a fantasy football draft live and shouting out a name and hearing somebody say, he was taken 2 rounds ago. Oh, okay, back to the drawing board. And then you're being rushed to pick your next guy. And it's like, next thing you know, you grab a tight end that, maybe he's got 1 game in him and then you never hear from him again. So I always say the computer is always smarter than me.
Yeah. I remember being in some of those live drafts back in the late 90s and 2000s. And they were just... By the time I got to my pick, I was already drunk. So,
Well, and that's the best thing about doing the fantasy football stuff. It's not so much about the playing; it's about the camaraderie. Which,
right. And we got a bunch of great guys here at the Sports History Network, anyway. So,
yeah, and
it's going to be fun. It's really going to be fun. Looking forward to it.
Me too. All right, guys. Hey, well, with that said, for speaking for Scott, myself, and Dana. Hey, thank you for joining us, and we will hope to see you again here. Hope to not see you again, but be speaking to you again very soon.
There's a goal in sight, play on with all your might, till the victory's won, get in and fight, 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 we're all behind you, men of Calvary, so when your backs are to the wall, don't ever yield. Come on, you red and white, we need a win tonight, hit 'em again, ye men of Calvary.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.